We're going to start the section of the Board of Supervisors meeting that happened on Tuesday, and then we will move on.
Talk about this project and take it over. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, sir, and welcome everybody. We're super excited tonight to introduce two longtime members of the society, gentlemen who spent the better part of a year getting this special presentation for you tonight for the citizens of King George County. I'd like to call up Mr. Miles Hastings and Mr. George Williams, if you could. Come on up to the podium.
Got some notes here in my pocket. Don't want to forget anything. My name is Miles Hastings. To my right is Mr. George Williams. We'd like to make a presentation this evening from the Historical Society membership, as well as from Canning Farm, where I live and work, to the citizens of this county. I'd like to begin this with thank yous instead of ending it. I'd first like to thank the Historical Society membership for sponsoring. I'd like to recognize Chris Dines, Eric Tolson, and the county staff that put some backbone into this. I'd like to recognize McDaniel Services for their help with some engraving. I'd like to thank Ed's Pens, a county business. I'd like to thank Mr. Larry Freeman for his help. I'd like to make a special thanks to Wallace Morton for his suggestion of Mr. Williams. And without George and his wife Sue, this project would have never happened, more than likely, because I didn't have the time to get it done. Some of y'all are familiar with the fact that Canning Farm was the county seat when King George was first formed in 1720. And they began construction of the courthouse at that time in May of 1721. The fellow that owned the property that I live on, his name was John Lomax. He was living over in Caroline County around the Portabago area, but he owned the farm. A lot of people say, well, where did that name Canning came from? Well, on the Prosser-Chetwood land patent line that runs between our property and Millbank, the immigrant William Strother in 1680s built a house of worship. One day I was thumbing through a French to English dictionary. That's what everybody does, you know. And I came across the meaning of the word canning. And it means the way of the church. That's how the farm got its name, even before the creation of King George County. There was also a tavern there at the same location run by a man by the name of Walter Anderson. He was a clerk, the janitor, he did quite a few things. All this can be found in our court order books. I would go there as a young man on a rainy day when I couldn't be in the fields and I would sit there with Elwood Mason, and he would show me the ropes of how to look things up. And one day we found a clipping that you'll see on that map over there. It's the only known thing we have that points to the location of the courthouse. Now, to jump ahead a few years, my family moved here in 1957. We were displaced out of Norfolk, Virginia, where we farmed. And they wanted to dig it up for the sand and gravel to build the overpasses and ramps for the interstate system. So here's where we ended up, was King George County. And when we moved here, there was a 2-year option on the property by a timber buyer to go around the farm, and he cut down a bunch of trees and he left them, and he didn't come back for them. One particular tree, which sits about 350 yards from the courthouse site, that was left, had some value to it. So we took it next door to Jerry Goodman, supervisor. His father, Worth Goodman, had a sawmill there. So it was cut up, and it was brought home, and it was put up in the loft of a barn for the next 60 some odd years. So there the lumber sat. Just so happens that Mr. Lomax, John Lomax, back in the 1700s, he supplied the lumber for the new courthouse. I thought, wouldn't it be nice to supply some lumber for the courthouse? Well, I approached Vic about it, but I guess it dropped through the cracks, and they decided not to do that. But I put more thought into it. As the lumber sat up there in the loft, the stump of the tree was still sitting out in the field. And when I was about 16 or 17 years of age, my uncle, Sam Hastings, who used to serve on the planning commission, he came up with a 2-man crosscut saw, and he says, I want you and your grandfather to cut 2 slices out of this tree. I want to make a table top. So 4 hours into one cut, 4 hours into the next cut, and we had his slab. The next thing you know, the next morning, the little piece of wood had checkered so bad it was unusable. But he told me, he said, count the rings, let's see how old this tree was. So that tree was 255 years of age when it was cut down in 1957. The map over there shows the farm in 1953. You could still see the tree in the photograph. So that put the tree birth date at around 1700. So in 1720, when King George was formed, it was a 20-year-old sapling, and it could look right across that field. It could probably watch a young George Washington register some of his first surveys. It saw a woman have her ear nailed to the pillory post for bearing false witness, and she was torn off of it, and they laid on 40 lashes as she was tied behind an ox cart and led away to the jail. When this county stretched from the falls at Falmouth all the way to Little PD Creek down next to Leedstown, they probably would have heard all these rumors of a declaration of independence from England. And you'll see some things in that box that prove that, yeah, there was a lot of British influence around here. So this tree that sat there all those years and sat up in that barn loft, I thought, what better way in this body compared to the courthouse, where unless you were speeding, you might not ever see it. But each citizen of this county can walk up and put their hand on something that saw the formation of King George County. George, would you help me unveil this thing? All right. Second item.
I don't have any notes, but I'll try not to take much time. Miles and I started working on this April of last year according to my notes. And his requirements for the table was pretty simple, a 2x4 table with a vanity shield. The podium, he had a rough sketch of it, a good sketch actually overall, but the devil's in the details. And so I came up with a couple of approaches to it, and we finally chose a panels instead of something solid for the sides. And of course that kind of presented a problem. I'm not good at real resawing from a thick board, and that's where Larry Freeman came in with the sawmill. He's a good friend of mine. And he cut some so I wouldn't have to make so much sawdust to get the panels for the side. And so anyhow, we continued to work. It's been a long project. We met with Mrs. Parker and county administrators, a few other people here in December, and I thought it was over. You know, I thought it was finished. We were trying to pick out what kind of finishes on it. And they called it, reminded us that we really needed a hold-down shelf for handicapped to use. So anyhow, we overcame that, and we picked finish, and my wife put the finish on it. And so here it is. And I spent a lot of time on it, and I came to King George in April of 1965, so I've been here almost 60 years. And I worked at Auburn for about 38 years, I think. It was a great place to work, and King George has been a great place to live. So I'd like to donate my time and energy to the citizens of King George. Thank you very much.
As a token to remember, we had a pin made for each of the members of the Board of Supervisors out of the tree. So as you hold that in your hand, just remember the creation of this county and that we're all part of the history of this county. Up here on the dais, you'll find the map that Elwood Mason had shared with me that gives a description of the courthouse. You'll also see an overlay here. The farm has changed little since that time, but it points out some of these places. It shows the site of the courthouse, the Strother Church, and the ordinary. Also the site of the tree shows the road, Colonial Road, but if you want to take a look at that. And then here in the box are colonial artifacts from the farm that shows how much activity was through that area because it was a bustling place at one time. But if you have time to look at that, we'd be glad for you to. Thank you.
All right, I could watch that over and over again. So, if you're, I've told you before, I'm not a historian, but I'm a lover of history. And when you see something like that, and you know what the effort somebody put into something like this, to make it a gift, to give it to the citizens, it's just a beautiful thing. I mean, it's a beautiful thing. Whether we have 50 people here tonight to enjoy this, or we've got the people that we have here tonight, we're the fortunate ones who get to hear from Mr. Hastings, from Mr. Williams, from Mrs. Williams, I hope, a little bit more than what you saw in here about the journey from April last year until now. We just have more questions for you. That's all it is. If you'd all come up, we have a place for you to sit up here.
Come on.
Oh, do you?
Talk right into it.
Yeah, this microphone you have to put right up to your mouth. That one there. So we have another one that I wasn't able to pick it up tonight to get it here in time, but.
You go first.
Questions, anybody? What would you? So looking back at the whole thing, is there anything that you would have done differently? Is there anything, knowing the steps you had to take? I mean, I saw your shop myself, so you had the shop that you need really to do that kind of work, which is beautiful. But was there anything along the way that you wish you had and didn't have, or the order of things, anything like that?
Well, the
Real close.
Is
Is that even on?
You know,
Push it.
I think you almost got to get to the point of looking. You said you got to.
oh, like that, like that.
I still don't hear it. I don't know if it's on. He might be going to get more batteries. That's probably what he's doing. He probably went to get more batteries. Hang on a second.
You got to pretend you're at boot camp. Start sounding off.
Hello. Yeah, it's on. All right. I think he's
Back talk a little louder.
yeah. I mean, it is just us. Yeah, y'all scoot on up a little bit. He can adjust the camera. There you go. There you go. That'll help. And he's going to bring more batteries with him.
Well, the only what the first thing I would have done different was I would have planned for the fold down.
Oh, right. The fold down table. So they mentioned that. They mentioned that when they talked to the Board of Supervisors, but when we went out to see it, it was myself, the county administrator, and the IT, Eric Tolson. And really, we didn't think of it until almost the end of the visit. And I didn't think of it. It wasn't me. I wasn't the one that thought of it. But they see that podium so often. Of course, he thought of it, fairly quickly, and then mentioned that it was necessary for ADA purposes. It's absolutely necessary. So, did you have to undo anything to? This is why I'm asking questions.
Trout check. Yeah, we had
I still can't hear it.
Yeah, it's still.
All right.
the podium is basically has 3/4 inch plywood inside for the shelves, and then you have the 4-inch panel and frame that goes around it. So you had to allow a little bit of I forget what they call it, relief, make it attractive to the eye.
Right.
Insets, things like about, I don't know if it was 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch. I think it's 1/4 inch. But you ended up with, you wanted to put a board on there to support your shelf, but there was a 1/4 inch space in between the two panels. And I was I was a little worried. I didn't know how much weight was going to be on
Right.
it. And I was afraid that they would crush the thing. So I had a couple ways of doing it. I talked to Miles about it, and he and I finally came up with one solution, which my wife just cringed when I told her about it. I said, well, I have one of those little reciprocating saws that goes back
Right.
and forth like that. I said, I'm going to cut out a rectangle right in the side of that panel. and hell, it worked.
Oh, wow.
We put the board in there, and it supports the.
There you go.
Oh, you gotta put it right.
Oh, you know what? I think it's because it had to be near that or something. It has to be.
Just try to put it right up close to your mouth when you talk.
Right up. Okay.
I mean, like almost like you're kissing.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay,
There you
okay.
go. Yep.
Anyhow, it worked out fine.
So how long did it take you from the time we made that visit until you finished it? Just the lever part.
Because I remember,
I think
About a month?
yeah, about a month. It was. I think you were there in December. Of course,
Right.
Christmas was there, and we were gone some, but it took a little while. And I had
I think we could hear better without the microphone.
and we selected to cut the hole in the panel solution.
Wow.
And the only thing it you can see the I had to put pocket hole screws,
Mm-hmm.
and you could see
Right.
them on the outside, but they're not real noticeable.
Right.
So if I'd planned for it, they wouldn't have been there.
Right, right.
How long have you been doing cabinetry? Is that part of what you did at Dahlgren?
How long have you been doing that kind of work? Is that what you did at Dahlgren?
No. No, I was an engineer at Dahlgren, and I didn't have a woodworking course in high school or anything, but I read a lot of woodworking magazines, and I had a couple of friends that were pretty good woodworkers. I mentioned Larry Freeman and Don Rowe, so I talked to them a lot about doing things, and I built quite a bit of stuff for our house. I think I told Miles one time. Wally and I worked together, Wally Morton, and when I went down there, I took some pictures of some stuff that I made from my house. I just wanted Miles to know that I did make a few things, but I told him I think I'm auditioning for a job that I don't really want. Because it's going to take a lot of time.
Well,
But it worked out.
you were the name that he came up with right away, and there wasn't another name. It was you. So
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I was talking to some other people, and yeah, we had a period of time there. His mother passed away, and I thought maybe he got somebody else.
Well, when I started the whole process, I had been to the head of the Home Builders Association for the county, tried to get some interest in somebody that might want to tackle the project from them, but didn't get a nibble. I approached a couple of people at the county level that I understood were good with working wood and couldn't get anybody to bite. My only regret in the whole thing is I didn't meet this gentleman 40 years ago, because he's a right nice fellow. And
see, now I didn't know that. I thought you guys had been friends forever.
no,
I didn't know that.
No.
I did not know that.
it was
Okay.
the first time we met
Wow.
was over this project.
Wow.
But it's always been the history with my family here in King George. How many people have helped us along the way? None of us make it through life without people helping us. But it's just great to live in a community where, you know, people care enough when you find the right people.
More questions? There's got to be more.
So how many hours?
This is Dan Thornton.
invested
This is Dan Thornton in Virginia Beach. I wanted to make sure that I understood the area that you were talking about. Did you say Millbank Creek? And did you mention the name of Strother?
Yes,
And that's William Strother, and you mentioned a 1720 courthouse in that area?
Yes, sir.
So is this area would this be east along the Rappahannock from where Millbank Creek is?
It would be, as Millbank Creek sits, it would be north, due north of
Millbank Creek.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
The Prosser-Chetwood line runs north-south from the mouth, the left bank of the creek, up to Route 607. It's a straight line, crosses 607 out into the middle of a field that I own on the other side of the road. And from there, the line is pretty much unrecognizable. But the original Prosser-Chetwood line from 1669 is still there.
Just to the east of it, I am familiar with that area from some research. Just to the east of there, the Strother family, to the east of the Strother family, from the Prosser purchase back in the, I guess, the 1660s, was a gentleman by the name of Anthony Savage.
Correct.
Savage came to that area and was a commissioner. And just to his east was another gentleman by the name of Simon Miller.
Okay,
and
you're on the Prosser side of the line.
Yes, and Prosser Creek, I believe, is just, it runs in that area just to the north of Simon Miller's property.
The courthouse.
The thing that was of interest to me, go ahead.
The courthouse side would be the Chetwood side. It would be east of Millbank.
Yes, yes. But the courthouse is of interest to me. I didn't know.
West.
At that time, back in the right before the 1720s, I don't know if they were meeting at individual family houses for court meetings, or whether or not that courthouse might have been there, if you know.
We were old Rappahannock County at that time.
Yes, yes.
So you would have been down towards Corrette, Virginia. Would have been the courthouse prior to 1720.
That would have been the courthouse then, okay.
Yes, sir. Essex County has some of our records.
Yeah, an ancestor, Anthony Savage, lived in that area, and he was a commissioner there. I've always been curious to where they met. I didn't know if there was a courthouse there at that time, or whether or not they were still meeting at some of the commissioners' houses.
Well, the courthouse, when we were formed in 1720, it was out of an act, and I can't remember the name of the act, but it basically, the last of the Indian tribes from the area had been rounded up by then. That was an encumbrance to their expansion. And so in 1721, the Nanzatico tribe was the last. There was about 50 men and women and children. And they put the children into servitude with several families. And the men and women were shipped to the island of Antigua. How many of them made it? It's hard to say. But that's how they were, the disposition of the tribes. And it wasn't until then that we started to see a more local form of governance. But the county at that time stretched from the falls at Falmouth down to Little PD Creek in Westmoreland County, and roughly the Route 3 corridor, everything south of that. The courthouse area sat in Sittingbourne Parish. Sometimes you'll hear or read references to striplings. that's something I'm still looking at, trying to understand why they call that area Striplings. Also referred to as Old Nanzeman Town. So evidently the area was fairly open when those first colonists started expanding. The Native Americans, the agriculture had opened up some quite large areas. I can
You
go
heard
on.
the Indian name Mangacamoxon?
That is the name of the creek.
That's the creek. Okay.
Yes, sir. Mangiacamoxon.
Mangacamoxon is the creek, not a village then.
Well, that could be debatable. Further up what's called Giles Point, which is the peninsula between the creek and the Rappahannock River. Chief Powhatan had a brother, I forget his name, but he had a village right there on the line between the current owner and generally that would be the area of Old Nanzeman Town. There were quite a few artifacts there when I was a child. I could fill up both pockets with arrowheads on a Sunday afternoon walk, and the Sand and Gravel Company took care of that.
Thank you very much.
So the deed that's on that board,
Yes, sir.
the county has it?
Yes.
So you can go to their records and actually look
Correct.
at the original deed?
I don't know if the reference to the court order book is on there. This is a later plat, but it's the only one that gives a plat description of the parcel where the courthouse actually stood. There are other references that say where the courthouse formerly was or where the courthouse is now, and we have an idea of who it was, but this is the only pictograph that we have. Judge Embry, back in the 50s, declared that it sat on his property, which is right above Berry Plain at the time. He owned a piece of property. What more would a judge want, I guess, than to claim that it was on his property? But he was grossly incorrect. The problem I had was I had lived there all my life. I know every little stream, every rock, every hill. And when I looked at the plat, I could see where the streams lay, and I knew exactly where it was. Then, as I had talked to you a little earlier, I started metal detecting when I was a teenager. And I crawled all around and I dug in every little thing I could find. And after that many years of doing it, you get a sense when you come across a site what it was used for, what it possibly might be. I've had the opportunity to work with trained archaeologists before. I learned things from them. I have a neighbor who has a doctorate in archaeology. She's very helpful and fun to listen to. But it's just is like solving a puzzle. But the biggest thing that we had was the Smith family, who still owns that particular portion. They had a verbal, an oral record of where it was. And that was hard to deny. They had been there since the 1830s. Captain William T. Smith, he was a naval officer. during the Mexican War. He was stationed on a ship off of the California coast. But he came back here in 1838. He retired from the Navy in 1848. And he was a farmer in the area. He had quite a bit of holdings, about 2,500 acres altogether. You know where Cleve Drive is now? Well, that was one boundary of his place. The other was this Prosser-Chetwood line, so it's a big section in that part of the county. But they were aware of the courthouse, having been there. And I wouldn't be surprised. They were very frugal people. And there's several old barns that are still standing on the property. I wouldn't be entirely surprised that there's not a timber from that courthouse, maybe even in one of those barns. That's how frugal they were. So,
What happened to the original courthouse?
well, our original shape of the county, we were long. As the Revolution came close, about 1774, 75, they knew what was getting ready to happen. They had the need to muster troops. Our muster point during the Revolution was right across the road from Round Hill Church in the parking lot. That was Ebenezer, was the name of that church that was on the other side there. And it just vanishes into thin air. The next mystery that comes, and it could be a sad story, I looked for it for quite some time, but the time period between 1775, when it comes up, no longer existing, till 1804, when the courthouse that was built behind our current courthouse, not the new one, but the former. There's a gap there. But we had two buildings that might fit the description, but it's going to take a lot of reading of the court order books to determine. It's an odd thing they would name a little small couple of buildings Office Hall, don't you think? But we know how Fredericksburg Historic Foundation has treated those two buildings. They were responsible for them. We know what's happened to them. But that's one possibility. The other is down there where they're proposing your solar farm. There's an 1863 Civil War map that shows two crosses that are not 100 yards apart. One at the current location of Shiloh Baptist Church, and one a little further east, right about the intersection of the Shiloh Loop and Route 3, closest to the church. That was called Shiloh Meeting House. Elizabeth Lee shared the minutes there years ago. I was researching something for the church when Shiloh split. You had members of the congregation, some of them meeting at the Shiloh Meeting House and some at the new church. Everyone always said it was over the question of temperance, but after reading the minutes, I discovered it had to do with predestination. Jack Billingsley's, I guess it'd be his great or great-great-grandfather, who was captain of the 9th Virginia Cavalry. He was the preacher at Shiloh as well as Massaponax Baptist Church. The conflict was going on at both of those churches. They actually went fist to cuffs in the front yard of Massaponax Baptist Church over the thing and barred the doors of the church. So I always thought that was a interesting thing. What else can I ramble on about?
I actually want to ask more about what you just said. So the second courthouse was where?
Possibly Shiloh Meeting House or possibly Office Hall.
Okay, it was the second one. And the original 1721, did that burn down or
We don't know.
just disappeared?
According to the court records, it was red oak timber. It was probably post and beam construction. So they would have set a post in a post hole. Well, red oak is not a very good wood to resist rot when it contacts soil. But everything at that time period in general, unless it was a home of someone wealthy, they were very temporal buildings. They were still using wattle and daub construction at that point. A lot of it was just rough hewn clapboards. There's very few brick at the site. There's a few. Possibly they could have had a step, but there were not enough to indicate any sort of permanent foundation. So as I say, it was a very temporal structure, and it was probably very simple.
Just a side note, looking through some of the the papers that Vic Mason gave me, is it seems that the original part of the courthouse, the current that soon will be not current.
1922.
Yes, the 1922. There are pieces of it that were made from this courthouse that was on the site that was torn down. So that has original
what pieces?
I
What did they
have
use
to
it
go
for?
back and look at it.
Probably the original, like, square 1922 courthouse, because it got extended in 70, so they probably just recycled some of the bricks.
No, this is from like the 18, whatever it was, the original.
1804.
Yeah, that, when they took it apart, they used some of it in the 1922
Okay.
section. That was in some of the paperwork that Vic
That's
gave
cool.
You could put that in the new museum.
Karen, what was your question?
me. Eventually, I'm going to give you all the scans I've done.
Put it in the new museum.
Yeah.
No, I
Yes.
was just curious if you knew how many hours you had invested in this project.
I don't really know, but quite a few.
A lot.
Yeah.
Does your wife know? So
What'd
he
you
said
say,
one of the things, and she didn't come up here to sit down because I'm always telling her I have questions for her. But he mentioned to the Board of Supervisors that she put the stain on, and so when we were there for the visit, I don't remember exactly what he said, but he said at the time when we were there for the visit that she was picking out the stain. So that was the first time I thought, I wonder what all she's done, how much influence, how many things that he asked her opinion about.
Well, just listen.
Yeah.
Listen.
Is this your hobby you've been doing for a long time?
Sue's brother asked me one time, so how much time do you have in that project? You've been talking about it for 6 months, but I don't really know, but it was kind of intensive. It's about all worked on when we weren't away. And we kind of designed it as we went. Now, one thing that took a lot of time, but I was worried about that Miles didn't really agree with me. He said I didn't even worry about it because it's going to be in an air conditioned most of the time, which is probably true. But if you see old stuff where you have a wide panel like a tabletop or with a podium top, wood expands in one direction, quite a lateral direction rather than along the axis. So I was a little worried about that because. I was a little anxious working, but wood was 300 years old.
Right.
Well, not only that, the wood had sat in this loft. It had never gone through a kiln process to stabilize the wood.
Right.
Although I have measured the temperature and as high as 120, 125 in that loft in the summertime. And it went through so many of those cycles over the years.
Right.
I guess your planer let you know whether it was hard.
Yeah.
The blades detail.
Did
It's
you-
pretty stable. I've used a lot of air dried. Well, just about all of it's been air dried. But I spent a fair amount of time worrying about. If you look at old furniture, you'll see cracks in it. See, I want this to be 100 years from now.
Perfect. Perfect.
You can check on it.
Right. No, I won't be checking on it.
But I mean, I hope it wouldn't have a crack in it. So I mean, that wood can move. I think they estimate about a quarter of an inch.
Really?
Yeah, it's a fair amount. So I spent time the tabletop and the podium. They'll move on the frame. They're fastened like at the front, but they will move back and forth. So you make they're screwed together. So you make a little elongated hole, and they'll move back and forth. So I don't think 50 years from now,
Right.
maybe it won't be cracked.
They won't be complaining to
Yeah.
you.
And then with the podium up the frame, the surround around there, I made it so it's fastened at one end. It'll move relative to the tabletop, and the tabletop will move relative to the other thing. So that took a little time figuring it out.
See, that's amazing to
Maybe
me
the
that
time
he can
wasted
do
on
that after reading some magazines and working with some woodworking people. I mean, that's incredible. It really is.
Yeah, the other, most of the things I built are like I built a bedroom furniture.
Mm-hmm.
I did make one special thing that Sue wanted. I made a lot of little things, but they were usually plans in the magazine that give you step-by-step stuff and
Right.
tips on how to do things. So I had to kind of find my way on this and trying to figure out
Well, and that's why I mentioned it to the Board of Supervisors that night, because they didn't mention that, but they told us that when we were there at that visit, that this was the first time he built something without a schematic or plans being handed to him. And to me, that was amazing. I mean, that's the amazing piece of it. Yeah. Yeah, that's
I
amazing.
do have about 19 pages of
Well, I know you're going to want to hold on to that, but we'd like to make copies of all the stuff, just all the stuff, so that we have that as a historical record. And how much wood is left, and what are your plans?
There's a good bit of it still.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'll add to that, Renee. How big was the tree originally?
How big was it? Yeah.
It was a pile of lumber. But I will tell you that it has done some other projects in the county. Probably the most prominent one would be the case for the vinegar Bible that's in the clerk's office. My father made that. My father made a case for the communion silver there at Shiloh. The door bar at Emmanuel Church that locks from the inside, it's made out of a piece of it. There was a lot of things that we made around the house. My mother had a sewing bench that was special to her that my father had built. That was used quite a bit of that wood, and a desk that her father had. I can't think off the top of my head of any others.
So this was a very large tree originally?
Yes, a 255-year-old walnut is pretty good size. Now, when we had it cut up at Worth Goodman Sawmill, the technology of the day was not a band sawmill, it was a circular sawmill. And so it takes a lot larger kerf, so you don't get the volume of lumber that you would. But it's still, it was a pile, and every time you had to work upstairs in that loft, you'd end up having to move something around, or, and that stump that sat out in the weather all those years, it's amazing we never burn it. But by the time I cut that slab with my grandfather, and I don't know if there's anybody here that remembers my grandfather. No, Bobby King knew him. But he's a little man of short stature. He was about 5'5". Here I am, 6'2". You can imagine being on both ends of a saw. It was somebody that, but my uncle insisted that would make the smoothest cut. But the fact that that stump remained all those years without us doing something to it, because we really didn't know. This was history that I would find later as I started really delving into it. We had heard things, but we didn't put two and two together until later. But it was a fella by the name of Wild Bandy out of Stafford, who I think it was his son that had the tour bus business over in Stafford. He was the one that was the logger who left the logs behind. Kind of just fate that he left it.
That's amazing. What's the name of the Smith Fall?
I believe they call that one Adalbert. Adalbert. It's a combination of Ada Virginia's name, and I guess it would have been her father, Albert. For some, Adalbert.
Heights on that.
Yeah. Are you talking about John Bollock's?
This where the Smith man owns.
Well, they own two.
Okay.
The brick house that's closer to me.
Okay. With the iron gate out front.
No, that was originally John Pollock's, and it was left to Albert Smith, who lives in Mississippi now.
Okay. Thank you.
But John had a sister named Ada Virginia. Finland was her last name, married name, but she was a Pollock. And they were out of the Dickinson family from down at Berry Plain.
Now that you two are a team, what's your next project?
I think we're going to retire.
Can I ask Mr. Williams, is that your hobby after you retire from the base?
I didn't hear what you said.
Is that your hobby?
I don't hear very well.
Retired.
Is that your hobby after you retired from the base?
Yeah, yes it is.
Yeah. Have you done anything for the Catholic Church since you was coming to the Catholic Church before San Anthony? Since they renovated the palace? Is that the older you use it also for the Catholic Church, San Anthony?
Yeah, do anything for the Catholic Church?
That's what she was asking.
Okay.
Yes.
I think she's wanting you to do something for Catholic
Because
Church.
they renovated the whole kingdom.
Oh, well, you know the, I don't know what to call it, the parsonage house. I can't remember the name of who he was. Mullins, I think the old Mullins house. Really, honey, Mullins house? The house,
Oh, the Mullins house, yeah.
it was Mullins, right?
Oh, yes.
They bought that and,
You built the podium, didn't you?
Yeah, I think for the
Podium
You build a podium
Yeah,
for the priest.
Yes.
for the priest?
Can you
San
hear?
Anthony.
A podium
Oh,
for the
no,
priest?
you built the thing on the bottom to make it taller because he was short.
Oh.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
A
You built
riser.
something to elevate it. Did you build something to elevate it?
Or elevate him.
I built a couple little things.
Yeah.
But the biggest project I did that is Father Bork was kind of a rough and tough guy. He liked to sleep up in the attic when he stayed there on a futon, I think he called it. So I got some Naughty Pine paddling finished on it, and I finished the whole upstairs with it.
Oh, wow.
So I think it's still there.
Wow. Okay.
I've been going to church in Fredericksburg lately because I can hear a little bit better over there.
Yep.
And Sue goes, we go to different churches, so she goes to hers and I go to St. Mary's now, so we've been doing that for a while. But I think I made a few little things, but I don't remember. They were not like the podium.
Well, when you go into his house, you can see
The woodwork.
the talent
Yep.
that he had.
Yep. I can just imagine.
He's a very modest
Yep.
person, but
Soon
a
soon
great
I
talent.
built soon I built a house too. So, I mean, really, we had a few contractors in, but basically we did most of it.
I'm not sure which one's the more modest of the two of you. And what was I going to say? Oh, the pens. So you and I spoke on the phone about the possibility of doing more of those and selling or whatever.
I have Ed's number.
Okay.
The local gentleman, Ed's pens.
Right.
And I thought that I would give you his contact number.
Right.
He's aware of what's planned.
Okay.
But you might want to think of some custom embossing or something like that to set them apart.
So does McDaniel's could they do it on something like that or not really?
That I do not know.
Okay, I'll give them a call.
That would be awful, meticulous.
It's small. Yeah.
Who made our pens anyway?
Huh?
Ed's pens here in the county.
Yeah.
That was a very nice gift.
They do laser embossing.
Yeah.
We that was one of my goals, was to only, I don't like to be discriminatory, but I only wanted King George people working on it.
Right.
I wanted it to be a collective effort.
Right.
So I didn't outsource outside the county on anything.
Yep.
Other than maybe when you got some of those fixtures for it. Amazon, I guess, got that.
Yeah.
I had a quick question. You kept referring to the Smith family. Is that the same Smith who became governor of Virginia? Is that the same family?
No.
Okay.
William Smith is descended from the folks down at Shooters Hill, down in Sick County on Warsaw is in.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. He moved here from Alexandria, but that's where his family was originally, the Smiths from Shooters Hill. I really came across some crazy stuff as I researched. We talk about the Prosser and Chetwood land patent, but Chetwood ended up selling that kind of like to I guess he was a guy that was handling Chetwood's estate, perhaps. His name was Cuthbert Potter. He, in turn, it went into the hands of Ralph Wormley Jr. Now, Ralph Wormley was the guy in Virginia. He was the guy at that time period. Then his daughter, Elizabeth, married the John Lomax that I spoke of in the presentation. John Lomax would go on to establish with a partner the Bristol Iron Works down by Wilmot. So there were some prominent people. And of course, Landon Carter ended up selling the property to Charles Carter of Cleve, and he at one time owned all that. And then it was St. Ledger Landon Carter, who was a couple of more generations down, who was state senator, and he was an author. He and Edgar Allan Poe ran around together down in Richmond, and he was the one that sold it to the Smith family.
Isn't that something? That's amazing.
Ralph Wormley was well known in the mid-1640s. There was a major Indian uprising then.
Right.
And Ralph Wormley was cited, I believe, for his gallant efforts on horse against the Indian chief Opechinigo in his village Minmin, the Pamunkey villages. That's a little bit of the history of Wormley, Ralph Wormley. Had a
Ralph
brother
Wormley
as well.
Sr. I was speaking of Junior. Junior, they were both prominent men in early Virginia, but number 2, the Junior, he was the one who rose to such prominence, and his family became one of the political forces in the state. I'm sure the influence that Elizabeth Wormley's name carried and John Lomax, somehow his son Lunsford Lomax was the one who sold it to the next person. But he was also a politician. They were all politicians, but sometimes I wonder, there's a couple of reasons I think the courthouse was situated where it was. One was the effect of the church there, because as we know, the Church of England was a political force in itself. Another thing, as a farmer myself, and being intimately aware of the soil through that area, that is probably the most productive piece of land in King George County. As far as natural fertility, you can just imagine the English tax system taxed you based on the quality of land. And I think when people arrived at that courthouse and saw what was growing around it, it made an impression on them. It's also the same with the Strother Church. His patent consisted of 500 acres, and the 15 or 20 acres, and the church sits on the edge of that. It's the best land he had. You wonder, why do you throw a building up right there where you've got your best piece of ground? Another exciting thing we found here in the last couple of years, my neighbor, Ms. Ball, working along with a friend of hers that she graduated from William and Mary there with, I believe Bob Chartrand is the man's name. He's an archaeologist. He did some ground truthing radar down there last spring. And lo and behold, at about the 2-foot level in the ground, there is a wall that runs around the perimeter of that church area, which was really exciting, and it's the same dimension as the church down in Jamestown. Evidently there was ecclesiastical dictates as to what size churchyards had to be. But that was something interesting that we saw last year, and it's fun to watch as you go through the computer and you go down through each layer and watch that wall show up right in front of your eyes. You wonder, well, of course the one in Jamestown had a brick wall around it, but this, it's a dug ditch, more or less, but I'm sure they probably had maybe a split rail fence or a palisade of some kind that was set in that earth around there. And why would you think they would have that? Does anybody have a guess?
Keep the cows out.
Yeah. Because back in colonial America, you didn't have to have a fence. You put a notch in your animal's ear, and that's how you identified them. We have to remember, when this was all happening, they were still paying a bounty for the heads of wolves. We had wolves in this part of the country. When I worked with Jay Harrison on the first archaeological dig at Millbank, we came across a trash pit, and I was the tallest one in the group, so they put me in digging in the trash pit till I got all the way in the bottom, and I did discover a tooth from a wolf, which was fascinating. Also, teeth of Norway rats. You wonder, what were they doing? It was part of their diet. They ate a lot of things we probably wouldn't think of eating today. Things could get very lean. But one of the neatest things, we got in the bottom of the pit, and there was a clay pot about as yay big around. You could still see a child's fingerprints in that pot where it had gotten fired in the fireplace, but you could see that child's fingerprints. That was something that just blew me away when we found that.
You mentioned soil. Where was the best soil in King George and the worst soil, and what is the soil?
I'm going to get a little political right now. The best farm in King George County is Plentiful Farm. The highest yields.
Where's Plentiful again?
That's where you have the second data center wanting to build. They're across from LaGrange.
Okay.
That is the best of the best. If Togo Graves knew what was getting ready to happen, if it does happen, he'd be spinning.
So that would be the best. What kind of, and then where's
the second best farm in King George was Mrs. Grimes' place, which was Berry Plains.
Okay.
Canning comes in third. So I guess I'm going to be number one.
So how about the worst? Like, where's the worst soil?
That's one thing. I don't know how well people read soils maps anymore, but you know we have them for the counties. But people don't have a grasp of what real soil fertility means. In the colonial period, people would show up on a spot and they could look at what was growing there and how it was growing, and they knew whether it was good ground or not. If it wasn't, they just moved on. The indentured people, the slaves, they were housed on these 4 pieces of ground to eke out a living. The wealthy planters took the best.
How about the area where you're talking about the solar farm, like Edgewood and Mr. Stork's property? Is that plentiful ground or kind of just...
It's kind of marginal.
Marginal.
And we won't go any further.
No, I'm just trying to understand it's fascinating.
But just remember, for that one new farmer to rise, it looks to me like there may be some other ones having to leave the area.
Yeah.
What did you say the years for the courthouses were again?
The first courthouse, 1721, May, till sometime around 1775. We don't have an actual date they moved out. The second one, we don't really know. Then you come up to 1804, the one in the parking lot of the administration building. And then I think 1924 for the 22 or 24, somewhere around in there, to present day. And then the new one.
So
Yes.
do you know when the 1804 one ceased being around, or when they stopped using it? As
I would say right about the time they started building
Yes, that is
the
correct.
following one.
That's in Vic's documents again.
There's quite a few. If you'll go search some of the old newspaper clippings
Yeah, I
online.
I found the dedication for
Yeah.
the 1922.
Right. But if you go back further, you can find like market days and other things. And sometimes people even describe the courthouse. They try to visually describe it in some of the articles.
I did have one more question. This is just, who are the original families here? Like the original families of who were?
There's quite a few of them. There's quite a few of them. Probably some still sitting in this room. That blood's been here for a while.
I just wondered, like, what were the old names of the first families?
Well, the Strother family, it's always fascinated me how this guy with 500 acres compared to these fellas that had thousands, how he did so well. And we're still scratching our head over that one. He was a member of the Merchant Adventurers when he left England. Don't know a whole lot about that group, but they were all chasing riches.
At some point, there was a great deal of merchandise trading there.
Yes.
I've come across records which indicate that he was a pretty successful merchant on that property. His son would marry Margaret Thornton, by the way.
Correct.
One of my ancestors there.
All right.
And part of that Strother property, I believe, portion of it, along with the Savage property, which I mentioned to you before, just to the east, 300 acres there were left, and I think that eventually became part of the Bell Grove plantation.
Yes, sir. I think it's actually a little further north from there. The late Beverly Pratt and I worked on the second Strother church together. We had a little bit of a disagreement as to where it was located. After you go past, are you familiar with the double curves there? Two sharp curves?
I'm in Virginia Beach, but I have seen some land flats. The Chetwood Prosser, grants, I guess, headright grants back from those days.
Well,
that were divided up, or that he sold off. Largely, Prosser sold off. I'm familiar with some of the boundaries on that.
Okay.
So I'm familiar with that. I'm definitely familiar with this Strother property that you're talking about, and that 500 acres. I'm very familiar with that.
All right, on the other side of Route 301, if you're on Salem Church Road, when you go down about a mile, the road takes two sharp 90-degree turns. In the second 90-degree turn, there was a deed plat there that mentioned, if my memory serves me right, it called it the Old Church Gate. This was been the early 1800s. With the metal detector, we went straight up that hill on Agnes Oakey's property, and there was a site of some description right on that elevation that is directly in front of that turn in the road. Mr. Pratt felt that it was on one of his ancestors, Eliza Pratt's property, further down the road close to the second entrance to Bell Grove. It was property that at one time belonged to the school system. There was evidently a school there. He thought it was on the same property that the school was on. But from deed plat descriptions, to me, it appeared to be the former that I was speaking of.
You mentioned you have a career in archaeology. Do you happen to know Nick Lucchetti by chance? You don't? Okay.
I do not have a career in archaeology, although I've always had an interest since a young child. And I have worked with archaeologists, but I'm a full-time farmer.
Thank you.
Miles, if
Yes.
you put any of this information gathered over your lifetime on paper, or when are you going to do it?
I'm not a writer.
Well, you can do an oral one, just simply talking about it.
Well,
You're
that's why we're
getting a
doing this
load
tonight.
right now.
This is an oral history basically that we have going on tonight. And these things are important, not just to record the history of the work that you've done since April, but even this conversation. I mean, this is.
I've forgotten
exactly
half of what I've read. That's the sad part.
Well, as Renee said about the plans that Mr. Williams put together, that we'd like a copy of it. So any of the documents that you've collected over the years.
The funny part about it, Earl, we're blessed at our courthouse that we can walk into the clerk's office and we can research all of it's there. It's there for the taking, but you have to pour through a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And when I was a young guy, I had the time to do it. This was before I was married with children and all that. But I enjoyed going up there on a rainy day and just sitting there for hours reading, you know. And for me, it was just like figuring out a big puzzle. But we have a big thanks to give to W.S. Brown, who was a clerk of the court during the Civil War. And we can even find in the court order books where they give him a commandment to go and hide those books. Stafford County suffered a terrible fate in that there was one preacher who was traveling through Stafford Courthouse area, and he talked about all the pages floating in the wind and in the mud of all these old court order books. Think of what that caused after the war, when you couldn't prove that you owned something. But King George had enough forethought to make sure those records were protected. And actually, Joe Williams, he let me detect there on his place. And right there, if you're going down 206, you can see a line of trees that goes through that front pasture. And right where the cattle guard is, the second cattle guard, when you go towards the house, on the right-hand corner towards the house, I found an eagle breastplate. I found bullets and buttons. They sat right there and were watching the man. How would you have liked that for people to be sitting there watching you to see what you were up
Which farm
to?
was that?
Waverly.
Oh,
Waverly.
across from the old middle school?
And actually, I did something kind of funny the other day. That same day that I was in there, I found a gold ring. And on it was the monogram, the letter L. And it's an old ring. It was resized to somebody's finger, but it's still a man's ring. Well, you know, Thomas Lomax Hunter, the poet laureate, was there. Well, guess which Lomax he was related to?
Thomas Lomax Hunter.
The same Lomax that owned the property that the courthouse was on. Now, that generation would have been possibly after that, but could this be one of the Lomax's family's ring? We don't know. We may never know. But I actually, one of the last surviving members of the poet laureate's family. You ever heard of Patch Adams, the doctor?
Yeah.
I wrote him a letter the other week, asked if he had ever heard of any family stories of a ring lost. But I haven't, that was just last week I mailed it off. So I'm curious to see if he writes back. He's 80-something years of age now.
If you search Thomas Lomax Hunter on YouTube, the first thing that pops up is him reading a passage out of Thomas Lomax Hunter's.
One of my favorite is when he talks about the residents of King George. They're not poor enough to own a night hound.
Oh, night.
Everybody has a coon dog.
That's right.
Just little simple things.
You
Like that.
mentioned the courthouse. Since they're reporting for posterity, what happened in that time? How he saved it? How he saved the documents in the courthouse in the Civil War?
Well, W.S. Brown was commanded by the Board of Supervisors at the time to put it in a safe place. Tradition or verbal legend has it that he hid it in the barn there at Waverly.
There's a portrait hanging in the corner.
Right, because he didn't save everything. There's only some, because when in the records that I was given by Vic, it shows how they recovered the will book that has George Washington's father's will in it.
Correct. Did you also know that we had George Washington's signatures in some of these court order books in his early surveys, but somebody went in there in the late 70s and took an X-Acto knife and cut them out. Yeah.
I'm not surprised. It's terrible. They did that with yearbooks too.
Years ago, you could walk in and you could grab any of those research books you wanted. It's a little tighter now than what it was. And well, it should have been, but you know, you trusted people years ago. But it only takes one bad actor to mess things up.
Anything else?
I could ask questions.
I know. I knew that was. I felt the same way before we even decided to do this. Is if we could just open the floor for conversation. There's just a wealth of information. Not just your knowledge.
Too long.
Yeah, your knowledge of history, just your ability. I mean, but finding out you two didn't even know each other, that's the highlight of my night right there. I thought you'd known each other all your lives.
Well, Renee, one of the things I want in the new comp plan, one of the things I would like to have is a historical record, because a lot of localities actually have mapped in their comp plan where the historic sites are. So there's no argument from developers. They do.
Yeah.
And that's one thing I'm going to be pushing for, is to have, and so your
Well,
insight.
Ms. Bender, I will tell you, in the years that I've metal detected, there's not many places in King George that you don't stumble across some type of site. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
This whole state of Virginia almost is like that. And it's sad to watch how many things are destroyed. But at the same token, you're talking about, if you start talking about archaeologists, you're talking about $500 an hour usually, and that was years ago. You know, nobody can afford to look at everything.
Well, I do have to ask this question, because this comes up a lot. And you know, there's a book, I think there's still a copy in the Historical Society of the book about Pocahontas actually living in King George.
Well, that would have been over in the north end. That would have been in Stafford County at that
Near
time.
Fairfield Beach, right?
Mhm.
That area?
I was privileged the other day, and I about shed a tear. The most beautiful sight that I had seen in King George. I was given the opportunity to go up into what began as a Revolutionary War fort, but then was used during the Civil War. But as I was privileged to be able to stand there in that spot, now that the leaves aren't on the trees yet, I could see the mountains. And I mean, not just a little tip on the horizon. I could see a prominent. I've heard of guys that work on the top of Mountain View Church, up on the roof. I think Monty Cliff had told me before that he had seen the mountains from up there. But the particular place I was at, it was breathtaking.
Where is that place? Or can you tell me?
I'd rather preserve it for the guy that owns it. But he says if the atmospheric conditions are right, you can see a second range behind the first range. And it just blew me away.
How far is the mountains from here? Probably that we can see. Quite a distance.
80? Not 80. Maybe 60 miles or 40 miles.
Okay. That's pretty cool. Well, I'll tell you, I grew up in the mountains in New Jersey. But you can stand up on the top of High Point and you can see the New York City on a clear day. And that's quite a distance away.
My sister lives close to Mount Mitchell.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, you can see 5 states from there on a clear day. But I was just blown away that you could see the mountains that well from King George County. That was a first for me.
Are you still playing any instruments?
Hmm?
Like to play for these people, for the believers, because
When I started having,
house started these children in
He's
the
a baby
40s. Thinking about that thing that you were part of.
yeah, when I was a young guy, I was 25 or so. I had a friend, young boy that was about 10 years younger than I was. We went to the same church together. His name's Greg Rollins. And Greg invited me to come play for this. It was a countywide youth group called Believers Because. And I went there and played bass guitar. And just so happens there was a young lady from Dahlgren that was there playing the keyboard. She would become my wife, Brenda. So that group, she's not in the picture. This is just the children in the picture. None of the leaders that were in this picture. But yeah, it was fun times. But we had a touring band and did that for a couple of years. I don't know how I found the time to do all those things. But yeah, it's fun to look at this picture and think about where all these children are now and what they've done.
Yeah.
I see one that's a doctor, one that's in banking, other one played in the Army band.
And they all move away.
Yep. Not many of them are still here. There's a few. But yeah, those were fun times. Yes, sir.
This is just random. I heard stories about how there was a burial mound in King George. Have you heard those stories as well?
More than one.
Do you think the county would have any records of where it was located? Because I know it was located gravel pits, but we don't know where.
What kind of burial mound?
Native American.
Okay.
There was a fairly large one found on Bell Grove. They ran into it by accident. Of course, it tore up a lot of stuff. It's in an area you wouldn't have thought it would have been a burial ground. No prominence to the spot. Of course, Ryan, he has a story about one. But
I heard, this is probably me getting it wrong, but I heard if you're going up to Fredericksburg on the left, you see those pits. That's where it used to be. But that's probably.
Yeah. I'm not intimately aware of any of those, but I have heard of the one over on Bell Grove. Not Bell Grove, excuse me, Walsingham, on the other side of 301.
Can you think of a story that'd be fascinating that's never told about King George? Like something in the history. I know I threw out there some story that probably is not well known. Caught you off guard with that.
Most of my stories I get from reading in the old newspaper clippings. One that I came across not too long ago, there was a gentleman plowing the field over at Bell Grove with a team, and a tornado came up and caught him, and he and the horses got tangled up. He got hurt pretty bad. There was also a biplane that crashed on Bell Grove, but your imagination is the limit to what's happened here. I could tell some stories on my generation, but I don't think it's appropriate here. But
can I ask you something? Who owns before these people from Austria were very grown? Who owned that farm?
the Clark family.
So what time period, when you say the Clark family, what kind of time period are you saying they owned it?
I don't know how long they were there. I can remember that Kathy Clark, she was good friends with my sister Laura, and she was there till sometime in high school, and then I think she left.
Would that be the 1950s then you're talking?
No, that would have been around 77, 75, somewhere in that range when they left. I think they left. I don't remember what happened.
No, I remember.
I was a little kid then. I was born in 1962.
Oh, you're so young.
I'm six.
You are a baby.
I'm 62 years of age, but the sun hasn't been kind to me over the years. You get weathered when you're out in it all day.
When you talk about Plentiful Farm being the best land in the property, who originally owned it? Say the colonial whose land? Do you know?
That I'm not aware of.
Okay, and then which one you might know? What's the latest that you know about it?
Well, I can remember Togo Graves. I remember him. And then he left it to Frank Taylor and his family.
Yeah, Laura Stewart.
Laura Stewart.
She is beautiful.
But I don't know what Togo's. But that whole front field was a peach orchard back in the 20s.
The Taylor Farm, the front field.
A lot of people don't realize that the northern neck was a fruit basket, basically of the East Coast in the early part of the century.
A lot of people have asked me, and that what was King George known for? Was it known for farming? You just mentioned fruit. Like, what was it known for? Raising horses?
Farmer.
Who knows?
Or was it certain areas were known for certain things?
I think it had a long history of the large estates and wealthy planters.
But what did they grow? Like, what were they doing?
Don't they grow tobacco?
Well, we were one of the first areas to grow wheat. Then you started to see a proliferation of mills. There were quite a few mills in the county. Later, we'd be known for the tomato canneries, but that was all up and down the northern neck.
You said
cucumbers.
Fruit basket, right?
Hmm?
And we were known as a fruit
Yes,
basket.
that was early part of the 1900s.
And what did they do? Peaches and what else?
Predominantly peaches, stone fruits. Up to that point in time, you had some very minor fungal diseases that could be treated with like Bordeaux mixture, copper sulfate, simple compounds. I started growing peaches in, I think it was about 84 or so, and we had a fairly good sized peach orchard. But disease started to become such a problem. To bring that Gibson thing back up, when I was a kid, we had sheep. We'd run about 250, 300 head of Western bred ewes. What put us out of business was domestic dogs. Back then, people would let their dogs run at large and they would pack up in large packs. And I can remember Sheriff J. Powell coming down one morning, and my father and uncle and several other men, there was about 7 men. We had thrown the offal from a cow that had been slaughtered in the woods. And they went down there that one morning and shot about 20 dogs. But these packs would run loose, and I mean terrorize people's stock. So you couldn't keep anything at that time. Harry Berry. He would come up to our house 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and he wanted us to go to court with him that day. And I don't know, some of y'all have probably heard the story of Harry Berry taking the sheep, the little lambs that had lost their mothers, and he put them in the car with him. He walked right up in front of the judge with those lambs following him right up through the court. So he was an interesting character. But I've lived at an odd time because I knew men who had plowed behind mules, and I've seen the latest technology. I grew up with a grandfather who was born in the 1880s and listened to his stories. And I was privileged in a way that I didn't have kids to play with when I was growing up. I had to go see my neighbors, and they were all these older people that had known Civil War veterans, and they could tell stories, and that's what you did years ago. You didn't have a computer to look at. You told one another stories. I'd go over there and see Jack and Evelyn King and visit with them, and had would have a big time with them. And I'd see a lot of characters as I grew up. I can remember a guy named Captain Joe. That's all I knew him as. He was a little short black man with I could remember that white wool hair. And I was sitting in the back of a 3/4 ton pickup on a tailgate with him. We would find him, he'd walk through the farm to get to the church landing. It was down on Millbank Creek to fish. Every day. That's the only sustenance I think the man had. But he would catch bluegill that, they weren't more than 4 or 5 inches long. And he'd have a bucket with a few of those in them. And he would put them up in the back of our truck, and my uncle would give him a ride back over off of Millbank Road. And I can remember riding along with him, and the cataracts in his eyes were so thick. They were just, his eyes were gray. How he could see where he was going. But I can see his smile, I can remember Nanny Bird Smith, the first figure I can remember actually laying in a crib. No kidding. They had up in the upstairs of our house where the laundry room was, my grandmother, my mother's mother, and my mom and Nanny Bird Smith would be in there. And I can remember looking up, and that's the first black face that I remember seeing in my life. And I remember we loved her so much. She was part of the family. And then when Martin Luther King was assassinated in '68, her daughter said, "You don't want to be working for these white families anymore." And she went away, and that was a weird feeling. When my sisters finally got old enough to drive, we would go over and see her. But she was getting pretty old then. But her mother was born a slave there on Pollock's property. The house where she was born is still standing. Her last name was Jackson. She was very well thought of in the community. She had one leg, and she would walk between these plantation houses carrying laundry with one leg, but people would stop and give her rides and such. But that house, like I say, is still standing. You can look up underneath the metal roof that's there now and see the cedar shingles still up underneath it. It's the corners are falling out and stuff, but it's still there. But yeah, a lot of characters around there. A My good folks.
This is Dan in Virginia Beach. Again, I was just going to mention to you, talking about the slavery, some of those stories there. There were quite a bit of slaves by those large plantation owners along the Rappahannock. Some of the wills from those days in the 1670s show lists of 10, 15, 20 family slaves that were passed on from one generation to another, or from one family member to one son or another son. It was quite a bit of slavery there, partially because of the tobacco that was there, and because of the river. The depth of that river allowed the ships to come right on up to those plantations along the waterline, and there to be able to carry that tobacco either to an inspection station, or if they were large enough, I think they could take it directly back to England. But the thing I wanted to mention to you that I think is an interesting story about that whole area, you mentioned Stafford. In the 1670s, those landowners that came up into along the Rappahannock from Gloucester and so forth, they moved in there in the 1640s and 1650s. In 1670, their whole lives were disrupted because Charles II over in England decided to gift 5 million acres of that land, largely unsettled at that time, but it was partially settled, to 7 of his favorite friends. They eventually descended to John Culpeper, and that became part of the, I guess it's called the Northern Neck Proprietary. Isn't that true?
Yes.
A lot of changes.
Yes. So those it's kind of interesting because all those landowners or those people that had come up there with grants, they had been granted land. Some of the plantations there along the Rappahannock, they'd been granted land. Some of them came up there and negotiated directly with some of the Indian tribes there and purchased land directly from the chiefs of those Indian tribes. And about 1670, 1673, the grant was actually made in 1649. But when Charles II regained the throne in 1660, shortly thereafter, they sent people over to that whole area and established the proprietary, disrupting that whole area in terms of the ownership of that property.
Yeah, all those head rights and that stuff, the back and forth with Governor Berkeley. Yeah, I'm sure it was very confusing sometimes, and I guess people wondered who owned what.
It definitely was. They used, you mentioned, I think earlier in your talk, you mentioned some of the different ways that they would try to denote the boundaries. The meets and bounds was the term they used. And in some cases, when they brought surveyors up into that area to try to survey the lands, to try to keep the disputes down, the only means that they had to survey it then was using, as an example, an oak tree located at a particular location. They would use that particular oak tree on the it would be a patent at that point, which would designate one of the boundaries for that property. It was very difficult. That was very difficult to know exactly where your boundaries were. It led to a lot of disputes, as a matter of fact.
Made a comment earlier about Office Hall. I ran across a comment here that you'd be interested in. 1734, 1747. William Fairfax was the agent of the Fairfax Proprietary, and the Sarah Haywood had the office for Lord Fairfax, the proprietor of the Northern Neck of Virginia. The office was situated equidistant between the Potomac and Rappahannock near the ancient road leading up the Northern Neck, which is actually right Office Hall. And could actually be the site of the original land grant office.
Yes, sir. But I wonder if later on it might not have served another purpose. That being possibly the courthouse. But this is something that I think if somebody who's up to the research would be an interesting thing to find. Because there's definitely a lapse between the first and the third, about 25 to 30 years. But it's only conjecture.
I know the boundaries of that grant was the subject of dispute. Lord Fairfax, I believe in the 1730s, had to sail to Virginia to try to settle the exact boundaries of all that land. And one of my relatives was called as a witness up there. He referred to Snow Creek, I think was the name of the one of the small rivers, but he referred to the fact back then that there were only 2 houses at that time above Snow Creek, which I thought was kind of interesting. It just showed the limitation of the growth of settlements up into that area. But the Lord Fairfax had to come over himself to try to settle a dispute over exactly what that grant was. Where did it go? Did it stop at the Rappahannock? Did it stop at the Rapidan? I think was one of the rivers that they were using to try to determine what eventually I think descended to Lady Fairfax, I believe. Catherine Fairfax, I believe, may have gotten it, but it was it's just an enormous amount of land to think about when you think about 5 million acres in that land, largely unsettled, went deep into West Virginia, and included the counties of Stafford, Old Rappahannock County, Westmoreland, King George, all of that north of the Rappahannock River was all included in that. I think it was nearly 5 million acres that Charles II gave away to 7 of his loyal supporters.
It's more grass than I'd want to mow.
It's a big tractor.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we gotta wrap it up. Sheriff Giles we're past his bedtime. Past his bedtime, and usually wrap things up around 8 o'clock or so. But I just want to thank Mr. Hastings and Mr. Williams. I mean, he's just wonderful. Also wanted to give a